Imagine you're scrolling through your feed and you see two clips back to back. The first is shaky footage from a pre-dawn raid. You see masked federal agents shouting, physical clashes as people are restrained. It's an ICE operation. It's messy, it's intimidating, it is, by any definition, a form of violence. The second clip is a small group of protesters on a campus holding signs. They're chanting, maybe something about anti-capitalism or anti-Christianity. It's just words and cardboard. Now, what if I told you that in the official view of the government, the first clip is just law enforcement, but the second clip, the one with the signs, is being officially classified as a potential motivator for domestic terrorism? This isn't hypothetical. There's an actual national security memorandum, NSPM-7, that lists the common recurrent motivations for political violence. And the list includes anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views. It's a bizarre framework, right? It suggests that the state's own violence, like that raid, is always legitimate, but that certain ideas are inherently violent. It completely flips the script, and it forces you to ask a very basic question. What exactly is political violence, and who gets to write the definition? Okay, let's unpack this. Our deep dive today is into this essential foundational question of who defines political violence. We are analyzing how a national security memorandum redefines ideological dissent as a national security threat, and how this echoes unsettling, often forgotten moments from American history. We're going deep into the framework that attempts to criminalize dissent by strategically blurring the lines between abstract political belief and dangerous criminal action. So we have to begin with the policy mechanism driving this new approach, National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, or NSPM 7. Now, when people hear executive order, they think of public actions affecting federal employees or, regulations. This sounds much broader, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. A national security directive or memorandum like this one, it's fundamentally different. It's not really about simple administrative function. It's more like a sweeping policy decree for the entire national security establishment. And that means, well, defense, foreign policy, intelligence, and the whole range of federal law enforcement agencies. It's big picture stuff. And NSPM 7, specifically titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, well, the Trump administration chose to publish this one, which isn't always the case with these directives. They clearly wanted to signal a major strategic shift in focus.
Right. And they weren't exactly subtle about who the target was. We know Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller, he actually stated that this memorandum represents, and I'm quoting here, the first time in American history that there is an all-of-government effort to dismantle left-wing terrorism. That declaration of intent seems pretty critical, doesn't it? It tells us exactly where the government planned to point its, enormous investigative resources.
Precisely. And that intent is then put into action through the actual language of the memorandum itself, particularly in the section that identifies these common recurrent motivations or indicia of political violence. So the policy framework, it really starts by defining the types of thought and rhetoric it considers dangerous.
And when you actually look at these indicia, it's hard not to be struck by how non-criminal they sound. They almost read like a list of, college philosophies or maybe protest slogans. We're talking about targeting ideas like anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity.
Yeah, think about what that means in practice. I mean, what counts as anti-capitalism in a policy framework like this? Is it arguing for, say, democratic socialism, or is it just criticizing Amazon's labor practices online? The memo leaves it deliberately vague, and then it also flags extremism on migration, race, and gender. And then comes perhaps the broadest, most sort of culturally charged indicator, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality.
That specific phrase, hostility towards traditional American views. Wow, that seems almost perfectly designed to capture any progressive or liberal stance on cultural issues, doesn't it? And then immediately frame it as an indicator of potential violence. It feels like it weaponizes traditionalism itself.
That's a really crucial analysis, I think. The memo directly links these abstract ideological positions, which, let's be clear, are protected speech, directly to the potential for criminal acts. And what's truly fascinating, or maybe concerning here, is the pivot the directive makes toward this concept of pre-crime. NSPM 7 states quite explicitly that the U.S. requires a national strategy to investigate and disrupt networks before they result in violent political acts.
So wait. The directive is essentially telling law enforcement, don't wait for someone to actually throw a Molotov cocktail. Start investigating based on the sign the protester is holding, or maybe the ideology the nonprofit is advocating for.
That's basically it. Exactly. This really mirrors the post-9/11 counterterrorism idea of preemption, but now it's focused intensely on domestic ideology. But, this immediately runs into a massive constitutional wall, because if I genuinely believe that the United States government is corrupt and should be completely reformed or maybe even overthrown, that belief, just the belief itself standing alone, is absolutely protected by the First Amendment.
Okay, so that brings us to the core legal point that seems to get missed a lot.
Yeah.
NSPM 7 uses the term domestic terrorism, but that label, it isn't actually a standalone crime you can be charged with, is it?
That is the essential legal clarification you should understand here. NSPM 7 absolutely does not create new federal powers or new federal crimes. There is no legal designation regime, no official list for domestic terrorist organizations in the same way there is for foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And Congress has, intentionally avoided creating a system like that for domestic groups, precisely because it would inevitably sweep in constitutionally protected beliefs and associations. It's a very tricky area.
Okay, but if there's no actual legal power to designate a group, why does the label even matter? Why is it so dangerous for the government to rhetorically target groups like, say, Antifa or climate activists as domestic terrorists?
Well, the danger is rhetorical and, crucially, investigative. The label itself, domestic terrorist organization, is profoundly stigmatizing. It gives the government maximum operational flexibility, you could say, to target people and organizations based on their beliefs. It allows them to leverage pre-existing investigative powers, particularly those under the Patriot Act, which, importantly, already contains a definition for domestic terrorism.
Ah, okay. Let's break down that Patriot Act definition then, because that's what agencies are actually using to launch these investigations, right?
Right. So the Patriot Act defines domestic terrorism for investigative purposes. It says it involves acts that are 1, dangerous to human life, 2, already criminal under state or federal law, and 3, intended to either intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence government policy through intimidation or coercion. But here's the key point. That definition exists only for the purpose of granting investigative authority. It lets the FBI, for example, use tools like wiretaps, surveillance, access financial records, things like that. It's not for bringing a criminal charge under that specific label of domestic terrorism.
Right. And so NSPM 7 is basically saying, take this existing investigative definition from the Patriot Act and now apply it wholesale to groups whose ideology matches our new list of indicia, things like anti-capitalism, regardless of whether they're actually close to committing any violence. That really shifts the focus from actions to associations and beliefs.
Precisely. And this is where you start to see the immediate, real-world chilling effect on dissent. It's not just theoretical. Think about this anecdote involving a young college student, let's call her Maya, out in Portland. She was studying social work, volunteering with a mutual aid group, helping distribute food, water supplies during the racial justice protests. She was also pretty outspoken online, posting some heavy anti-corporate rhetoric, very critical of institutional racism.
Okay, so just based on that description, she probably ticks multiple boxes on the NSPM 7 list. Maybe extremism on race, maybe anti-capitalism. She's engaging in protected speech and community aid, but her ideology is now potentially flagged under this memo.
Exactly. And as the rhetoric ramped up following NSPM 7 about labeling left-wing groups as domestic terrorists, she and her small mutual aid group faced a pretty profound consequence. They weren't accused of any violence, nothing like that. But their organizational bank account, which they only used for collecting donations to buy food and tents for people, it was suddenly frozen. The reason given? Suspicious activity.
Wow. No charges, just account frozen. That's devastating for a small grassroots group. It basically cuts off their ability to function entirely.
It absolutely did. The organization felt quite strongly that they were being targeted not for any actual criminal conduct, but purely for the fiery political ideology they expressed online and at protests. And Maya, she stopped participating altogether, not because she changed her beliefs, but the risk, the fear of financial disruption, the worry that a protected act of dissent like, posting a political critique or just organizing a community kitchen could somehow be twisted and relabeled as part of a criminal conspiracy related to terrorism. It was just too high for her. And that really is the ultimate function of this kind of vague ideological targeting. It forces self-censorship. It freezes the organizational infrastructure that supports dissent.
Okay, so NSPM 7 explicitly targets left-wing political ideology. But to really get the full picture of its impact, we have to look at how the government applies this label of political violence selectively, right, across the whole political spectrum. And I think the contrast in the language used by the Trump administration itself when talking about different protest groups is probably the clearest example of this selective enforcement.
Oh, absolutely. The language used to describe the racial justice activists back in 2020, especially after George Floyd's death, it was immediate, it was absolute, and frankly, it was dehumanizing. Protesters were just relentlessly described as thugs, anarchists, and terrorists.
And the response wasn't just words. It was a clear threat of state violence. President Trump threatened swift, really uncompromising force. He tweeted that infamous phrase, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." He even went out of his way to attack the symbols of the movement, calling a Black Lives Matter mural a symbol of hate. It was a whole narrative designed to frame dissent as inherently criminal, something deserving maximum suppression.
Right. Now, hold that image in your mind, that picture of targeted suppression, and compare it directly to the rhetoric used by the very same administration towards the individuals who violently breached the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. An act, let's remember, that involved assault, serious property destruction, and a direct attempt to overturn a democratic election.
Yeah, the shift it's jarring. It speaks volumes about ideological alignment, really. While that insurrection was actually happening, President Trump told the rioters to go home in peace, okay? But then immediately followed up with these expressions of profound sympathy. He said, "I know your pain, I know you're hurt, and crucially, we love you."
And later, in statements that followed, that framing only got stronger. He repeatedly referred to the pro-Trump mob not as criminals or terrorists, but as great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long, end quote. So the very same actions, property damage, disruption, confrontation with authorities that were framed as domestic acts of terror when done by left-wing protesters were suddenly reframed as, legitimate expressions of grievance when carried out by his own supporters.
And the actual law enforcement response on the ground that day, January 6th, it just underscored this rhetorical difference with, devastating clarity.
It really did. And the racial hypocrisy was pointed out almost immediately by the Black Lives Matter movement itself. They noted, quite rightly, that their protests were routinely met by overwhelming militarized force. We're talking the National Guard deployed with assault rifles, tear gas, flashbangs, a really clear, aggressive mandate to disperse crowds. But in stark contrast, the Capitol rioters, who were actively trying to stage a coup, they were met by what BLM described as an underwhelming number of law enforcement personnel who act powerless to intervene.
It's the difference between overwhelming force and almost passive observation. The state, through its actions and its rhetoric, communicated very clearly which types of disruption were seen as legitimate grievance and which were illegitimate terror. And it seemed purely based on who was doing the disrupting.
And you see this pattern repeated at the local level all the time. It really reinforces this idea that the label political violence is often completely decoupled from the actual physical threat posed by an action. I was looking at an account from a journalist, actually, who tracked 2 incidents in his local county. Happened in the same year.
Okay, let's hear that contrast.
So the first incident involved climate activists protesting a pipeline. They held, pretty anti anti-capitalist views, and they peacefully blocked some construction equipment. Nothing violent. The response, immediate and severe. The sheriff's department actually cited federal anti-terrorism guidelines, deployed tear gas, made multiple arrests, and the district attorney seriously considered leveling domestic terror charges against them, arguing they were disrupting critical infrastructure. So the state clearly viewed their actions, fueled by that anti-capitalist ideology, as inherently criminal and a precursor to terrorism.
Okay, so peaceful protest, anti-capitalist message, met with tear gas and potential terror charges. What was the second incident?
The second incident involved a heavily armed, self-styled militia group. They showed up at a school board meeting to protest mask mandates. They were openly carrying firearms, shouting, intimidating elected officials and school staff just by their presence and their weapons. Now, the same police department that tear-gassed the climate activists, they did nothing more than observe this militia group, and the department even publicly labeled their conduct as simply an exercise of Second Amendment rights.
Wow. So armed intimidation at a school board meeting is exercising rights.
Yeah.
But peacefully blocking a pipeline is borderline terrorism.
Exactly. Because the militia's ideology, you could argue, was more aligned with the administration's favored views, their armed threat was interpreted as a legitimate exercise of rights. Meanwhile, the peaceful anti-capitalist disruption was framed as a prelude to terror.
This kind of selective application, it just perfectly illustrates that classic political science concept from Max Weber, doesn't it? About the state and legitimate force.
It really does. Weber argued famously that the modern state is the political entity that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a specific territory.
Right. So if the state holds the monopoly on legitimacy, then it's on violence, like that ICE raid we started with, or the police deploying tear gas. It's inherently legitimate simply because the state controls the means of legal coercion. It's law enforcement.
Precisely. And NSPM 7 acts as a powerful tool to enforce that ideological side of the monopoly. By defining the state's actions as legitimate law enforcement while simultaneously criminalizing the ideas of the opposition like anti-capitalism or anti-Christianity, the memorandum reinforces that monopoly. So only force or threats that come from outside the state's accepted ideological boundaries get labeled political violence. And that label then justifies using maximum force against those opponents, while at the same time minimizing or even excusing the criminal conduct of actors who are seen as ideologically aligned. Ultimately, the memo isn't really about controlling violence itself. It's about controlling the political narrative around the use of force.
You know, it's easy to look at NSPM 7 and this selective enforcement we've just been talking about and feel like this is some uniquely modern problem, maybe driven by today's hyperpolarization. But this impulse, the state's impulse to criminalize ideological opposition, it actually goes way, way back. It's deeply rooted in the earliest days of the American Republic. We really need to look back to 1798.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The late 18th century, it was a time of profound national anxiety. The Federalist Party, led by President John Adams, they were intensely fearful of domestic political subversion. This fear was really fueled by the ongoing quasi-war with France and the sort of terror that French revolutionary ideals might spread to America, the very idea that radical anti-establishment ideology could actually overthrow the established order here.
And to fight this perceived threat, the Federalists, well, they basically rammed through the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These were actually 4 separate statutes, and they were designed not just to restrict foreign influence, but very explicitly to crush their domestic political rivals, the Democratic Republicans, who were led by Thomas Jefferson.
Right. And the most immediate, and frankly the most constitutionally offensive of these acts, was the Sedition Act of 1798. This law essentially made it a federal crime to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States. But here's the crucial part. The law was fundamentally partisan. It protected the president and Congress from criticism, sure, but it explicitly excluded the vice president, who happened to be Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the opposition party.
So it was just a naked attempt to silence the press and political opponents. And the government used this act with, well, ruthless efficiency, didn't they? The very first person arrested under the Sedition Act was Benjamin Franklin Bache. He was actually Benjamin Franklin's grandson and the editor of a really influential Democratic Republican newspaper, the Philadelphia Aurora.
That's right. And Bache was charged with libeling President Adams. And what was his supposed crime? Calling Adams the blind, bald, crippled, toothless, querulous Adams? I mean, just think about that for a moment. A man faced federal prosecution, potential jail time, for insults that today would barely even register on a political blog, probably. Now, Bache tragically died of yellow fever before his trial could conclude, but the message was sent loud and clear. The government was willing to criminalize satire and political criticism.
And the prosecutions didn't stop with journalists. They targeted elected officials too, which really proves the political intent behind the whole act. Matthew Lyon, he was a Democratic Republican congressman from Vermont. He was fined a pretty significant sum for the time, $1,000, and actually jailed for 4 months. And what did he do? He simply accused the Adams administration of engaging in ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. He was literally jailed for criticizing the style and perceived corruption of the executive branch.
Yeah, the Federalists were incredibly meticulous in their targeting. Another really prominent victim was James T. Callender. He was a writer who published a book calling Adams a repulsive pedant, a gross hypocrite, and an unprincipled oppressor. Callender was convicted, fined, and jailed for 9 months. So these cases, they really show the chilling effect wasn't just theoretical. The Sedition Act literally allowed the ruling party to use the power of federal law to neutralize ideological opponents based purely on their political opinions.
It was just an overwhelming misuse of state power. But unlike NSPM 7, maybe, the Sedition Act actually had a kind of political self-correct mechanism built in, didn't it?
It did, thankfully. The sheer abuse of the Sedition Act, the public outcry against it, was actually instrumental in rallying support for Thomas Jefferson. He won that critical election of 1800, often called the Revolution of 1800. And upon taking office, Jefferson immediately pardoned everyone who had been sentenced under the Sedition Act. Later on, Congress even went back and repaid the fines that had been levied. The act itself, very fortunately, had a built-in sunset clause, so it expired in 1800. It really marks one of the earliest and most important battles for free speech in the Republic's history.
But the threat didn't completely vanish then. Of those 4 original Alien and Sedition Acts from 1798, 3 were either repealed or expired pretty quickly. But one of them incredibly survived, and it remains codified in U.S. law even today. The Alien Enemies Act, or the AEA. It was passed July 6, 1798.
Yes, and this is the one that feels like a ticking time bomb sitting in the legal system. The AEA grants the president truly vast powers, specific to the executive branch, to arrest, relocate, or deport any foreign national. Originally, it specified any male over 14 who comes from a foreign enemy country, and this applies during times of declared war or even just threatened invasion. The power is virtually unchecked by the courts, and crucially, it had no sunset clause. It's still on the books.
And its history is, frankly, terrifying. It served as the legal justification for targeting huge populations during major global conflicts, right?
Oh, yes. It was used against British nationals during the War of 1812. In World War I, it was the basis for targeting nationals of the Central Powers, Germans, Austro-Hungarians. And then in World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt used the AEA authority, through presidential proclamations, to apprehend, restrain, and remove thousands of Japanese, German, and Italian foreigners living in the U.S. right after Pearl Harbor. Now, while most Japanese Americans were detained under the separate, infamous Executive Order 900666, the AEA was the specific legal authority used for the internment of German and Italian nationals.
And the courts have shown incredible deference to this power over the years. There was a Supreme Court case in 1948, Ludek v. Watkins, was there?
That's the one. And the court ruled in Ludek that detainment under the AEA could legally continue until the president, solely in his discretion, determines that the hostilities have actually concluded, or until a formal peace treaty is signed. It essentially ties a person's liberty not to a clear legal end date, but to the executive's subjective judgment of when a threat is over, which could be never.
And that enduring power is exactly why the AEA becomes so terrifying in the context of modern political polarization. We actually saw its modern invocation very recently by President Trump in March 2025.
That's right. He invoked the AEA specifically to try and expedite the mass deportation of foreigners. He targeted Venezuelan suspected gang members, and he explicitly called their presence an invasion by the Tren de Aragua gang.
So a law designed in 1798 to target potential French sympathizers during a quasi-war with France is now being dusted off and deployed in the 21st century to target specific immigrant groups based on a presidentially declared threat of invasion.
That's exactly the mechanism, and this invocation, as you might expect, immediately triggered major legal fights, specifically the case JGG v. Trump. Initially, the Supreme Court actually vacated a temporary restraining order that a lower court had put in place against the administration's actions. But the situation escalated really quickly after that. The Supreme Court later issued an emergency late-night order in a subsequent related case, AARP v. Trump, and this time they halted the deportation process specifically in Texas.
That kind of emergency halt from the Supreme Court, especially late at night, that signals profound judicial skepticism, doesn't it? It feels unusual.
It absolutely does. For the Supreme Court to intervene like that in an emergency capacity and stop a process based on such an ancient, broad executive power, well, it indicates a very high degree of concern. Likely concern that the administration wasn't even complying with the most basic due process requirements, like providing adequate notice to the people being targeted for removal. So, the enduring legacy of the Alien Enemies Act is that this extraordinary, almost unchecked power remains available to the executive branch. It's a stark reminder of how easily a political crisis, especially when amplified by ideological rhetoric about threats and invasions, can resurrect these old mechanisms designed to bypass the usual safeguards of due process.
Okay, so we've established that NSPM 7 targets ideology, not just actions. And we know this kind of thing mirrors the political repression we saw way back in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now we really need to dig into how the modern enforcement machine, this massive kind of hybrid federal-local apparatus, is actually directed by this national security memo today.
Right. So NSPM 7 explicitly directs the federal government to use the maximum extent of its investigative and surveillance powers. And it does this by leveraging the Patriot Act's existing definition of domestic terrorism, again, purely for investigative purposes. And the primary weapon in this modern arsenal is the FBI's network of joint terrorism task forces, the JTTFs.
Can you just explain the scale and function of these JTTFs for listeners? What exactly are they? How big are they?
Sure. JTTFs are these massive collaborative hubs. We're talking about approximately 200 task forces spread across the country. They comprise over 4,000 personnel in total. And these personnel are drawn from more than 500 different state and local law enforcement agencies, plus, of course, federal agencies like the FBI itself, ICE, ATF, and others. When a state or local police officer joins a JTTF, they are temporarily deputized, essentially. They're designated a special federal officer.
Wow, that's a really crucial distinction. So being designated a special federal officer means they gain federal authority, they get access to federal resources, and often they get federal immunity.
Yeah.
Which effectively lets them bypass stricter civil liberties protections or surveillance regulations that might exist at the state or local level.
That's exactly the concern. It allows the federal government to insert itself much more deeply into the local policing of ideological dissent. And the history of JTTFs, well, it's already plagued by accusations of abuse long before NSPM 7. For years, civil liberties groups have criticized them for monitoring Black Lives Matter activists, for targeting entire Muslim communities based purely on religion, not suspicion, and for conducting surveillance and sometimes intimidating visits against environmentalists and journalists whose work challenged government policies or powerful corporate interests.
So NSPM 7 essentially takes this pre-existing, already controversial surveillance framework and specifically points it toward leftist political ideology, defined by those really vague indicia, anti-capitalism, hostility to traditional views that we talked about earlier.
Yes, and the scope of NSPM 7 goes far beyond just street-level protests. The memo directs the JTTFs to investigate potential federal crimes relating to the recruiting or radicalizing of people for political violence. But crucially, it specifically targets the organized structures, networks, entities, organizations, funding sources, and predicate actions behind them. It's going after the infrastructure.
Wow. So this sounds like a wholesale attack on the civil society infrastructure that supports dissenting viewpoints.
Yeah.
It's not just the person holding the protest sign anymore. It's potentially the organization that bought the cardboard for the sign, and maybe even the foundation that paid for that organization's rent.
That's precisely the implication. The memo explicitly instructs JTTFs to investigate funders and their leadership. It goes even further, tasking the Treasury Department and the IRS, the government's financial enforcement and tax bodies, to ensure that no tax-exempt entities, like nonprofits or foundations, are directly or indirectly financing political violence or domestic terrorism.
That sounds like a potential financial chokehold. I mean, if you are a large philanthropic foundation, or maybe even just a small community nonprofit, and you give a grant to a group working on, say, police accountability or climate justice groups that often express anti-establishment or maybe anti-capitalist views, you now risk an IRS audit or a Treasury investigation based on these extremely vague, potentially politically motivated criteria defined in NSPM 7.
The chilling effect on legitimate, constitutionally protected advocacy becomes enormous. The sheer vagueness surrounding terms like political violence or indirectly financing makes organizations, their funders, and individual activists prioritize self-preservation over engaging in robust, maybe controversial dissent. Furthermore, the memo even suggests using the notoriously vague terms of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, or FARA.
Their that's typically used to make sure lobbyists disclose when they're working for foreign governments, right? How could FARA possibly be weaponized in this domestic context?
Well, the argument could potentially be stretched. It could be used to target nonprofits, think tanks, even journalists who receive any kind of international funding, or maybe just interact regularly with international partners if their work happens to challenge U.S. policy or expresses views the administration dislikes. The government could threaten to label them as undeclared foreign agents, effectively chilling a whole range of protected speech simply because the underlying viewpoint is unpopular with whoever holds power at the moment. It feels like a deliberate strategy to sow fear, intimidate, and ultimately silence opposition using bureaucratic pressure points, not just direct law enforcement.
You know, the moment we start talking about the state mechanism targeting political organizations through financial disruption, through organizational interference, my mind just immediately jumps back to that really painful historical precedent from the mid-20th century.
It's almost impossible not to draw the parallel with COINTELPRO. That was the FBI's top-secret, systemic program run by J. Edgar Hoover for years.
Right. And we often forget, or maybe it's not taught enough, that COINTELPRO's main objective wasn't actually prosecution most of the time. It was disruption and neutralization.
That's the absolute key distinction. COINTELPRO was explicitly designed, in the FBI's own words, to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize. Black leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights groups, labor unions, anti-war activists, basically anyone Hoover deemed subversive. The FBI used the pretext of fighting subversion or communist influence, or sometimes violence, to engage in widespread illegal surveillance, infiltration, financial interference, planting false stories in the media, all sorts of dirty tricks against peaceful, constitutionally protected groups.
So the strategy we see being laid out in NSPM 7, using the official banner of national security and the fear of terrorism to suppress ideological dissent by targeting financial networks, targeting organizational structures, it really does feel like a modern, maybe digitally enhanced echo of COINTELPRO. And the danger is it threatens to break public faith in democracy itself by making legitimate political opposition feel like, or be treated like, a criminal enterprise.
It definitely creates a dangerous legal and political environment. But, we really must end by underscoring the enduring constitutional safeguards that still exist. No president, even armed with a comprehensive national security memorandum like NSPM 7, can legally just rewrite the Constitution. The First Amendment protections, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, freedom of association, they remain the bedrock of the system.
Even if the government labels those beliefs extreme or disfavored or hostile to traditional views, they're still protected, right?
Precisely. And crucially, if individuals or tax-exempt nonprofits find themselves investigated or targeted under the broad sweep of NSPM 7, they retain their full right to due process. That means the right to notice of the accusations against them and a meaningful opportunity to challenge wrongful government conduct in court. These constitutional guarantees ensure that federal and state agencies, even when they're acting under a highly political directive like this one, ultimately must face accountability if they attempt to punish people based purely on their political ideology rather than on concrete criminal acts. We can probably anticipate years of litigation challenging actions taken pursuant to this memo, which will force the courts, hopefully, to draw a clear line between political thought and genuine threats to safety.
So what this deep dive really reveals, I think, is that the definition of political violence is often less about the objective nature of the act itself and much more about the ideological identity of the actor. It serves as a flexible, powerful political tool.
And it has since the founding of the Republic. In these moments of national crisis, you mentioned the quasi-war in 1798, we can add the war on terror after 2001, and certainly the heightened political polarization we see today. The state has consistently sought to deploy these vast powers to target speech and belief it finds threatening.
Yeah. It seems the struggle to protect legitimate dissent against these shifting state-sanctioned definitions of threat is just this continuous, necessary thread woven all the way through American history. It forces us, generation after generation, to constantly defend the fundamental principle that ideas, no matter how disruptive or unpopular they might be, are not crimes.